5 o'clock in the morning, June 6, 1944. Oberleutnant Walter Ohmsen pressed his eye to the rangefinder atop the Crisbecq Battery and felt his hands begin to shake. He was 32 years old, a professional naval officer who had spent 2 years believing the propaganda whispered into every German soldier's ear along this coast. The English Channel was a moat. The Atlantic Wall was unbreakable. The enemy was soft, disorganized, incapable of the kind of industrial miracle it would take to cross that water in force. Then the horizon disappeared. Not clouds, not fog, ships. Thousands of them, packed hull to hull from one edge of the world to the other, a gray steel tide rolling toward the sand beneath his boots. Ohmsen tried to count them and lost track before he reached 100. Somewhere behind him, a radio operator was still typing the morning's routine weather report, unaware that the war his country believed it could still win had already ended in the time it took one lieutenant to lift a pair of binoculars. In 6 hours, 3 of the finest divisions in the German army would begin to break. In 6 weeks, an empire that called itself invincible would start counting its dead in the hundreds of thousands. Walter Ohmsen did not know any of that yet. He only knew that everything he had been told was a lie, and that the tide sailing toward him could not be stopped by men, only by mathematics that no longer existed. Before we begin, pour yourself a warm cup of coffee or tea. Take a quick look at the clock. What time is it where you are right now? Let us know in the comments. Then sit back and enjoy today's World War II story. The Crisbecq Battery sat on a low rise above the village of St. Marcouf. 3 concrete casemates staring out across marshland toward a beach the Germans had not yet learned to call Utah. Walter Ohmsen had commanded this position for months, and he knew every meter of it the way a man knows the rooms of his own house in the dark. 3 Skoda guns, Czech-made, 210 millimeters each, capable of throwing a shell the weight of a grown man out past the horizon. He had drilled his crews until the loading sequence lived in their hands rather than their heads, until the youngest boy on the battery, barely 18, could ram a shell home without looking. The battery had its own smell, damp concrete and gun oil, and the salt tang that never left the marshland air, and its own sounds, the creak of gun mounts traversing on their rails, the low murmur of men playing cards by lamplight during the long dead hours between watches. Ohmsen had come to know these details the way a priest comes to know the particular silence of his own church. He walked the casemates most nights before sleeping, running a hand along the cold concrete, checking the ready racks of shells stacked like sleeping soldiers waiting for an order that never seemed to arrive. Ohmsen was 32, old enough to remember a Germany before the swastika, young enough to still believe, most days, in the men who had raised it. He had joined the Navy as a young officer with dreams of open water, and had instead spent 2 years staring at a gray channel from a concrete bunker, waiting for an enemy who never came. The waiting had a way of curdling into certainty. Certainty that the wall of guns and mines and steel obstacles strung along this coast for 400 miles was exactly what the propaganda posters called it, unbreakable, the western edge of a fortress that would swallow any invasion whole. There were nights, more of them than he would ever have admitted to his men, when a different thought crept in beneath the certainty. He would stand on the observation platform in the small hours, listening to the surf work against the tidal obstacles below, and wonder what it would actually look like, an invasion fleet, if one ever came. He had never been able to picture it clearly. His imagination, trained on briefings about a weakened, war-weary enemy, simply could not produce an image large enough to match what a true crossing of the channel would require. He told himself this failure of imagination was proof the enemy could not do it either. It did not occur to him that the failure was his own, and not the enemy's. He believed it because he had to. Belief was easier than the alternative, and the alternative was a thought no officer allowed himself to finish out loud. On the night of June 5th, that belief had not yet cracked, though the first hairline fractures were already spreading 50 miles to the east. At the headquarters of Army Group B, Inside the Château de la Roche-Guyon, Lieutenant General Hans Speidel sat behind a desk, piled with reports that made less sense with every passing hour. Speidel had been Chief of Staff to Field Marshal Erwin Rommel since the middle of April, and he understood better than most men in the building that Rommel's instincts were rarely wrong. But Rommel was not here. He was 400 miles away in Germany, celebrating his wife's birthday, having concluded days earlier that the weather over the Channel was too foul for any Allied fleet to risk a crossing. The Allies had read the same weather charts and reached the opposite conclusion, gambling on a narrow window no German meteorologist believed would be used. At 1:20 in the morning, the telephone lines into 7th Army headquarters began to carry word of massive parachute drops scattered across the Normandy interior. Men of the 82nd and the 101st Airborne Divisions, more than 13,000 of them, were falling out of the night sky from American Douglas transport planes, tumbling into orchards and flooded fields and the gardens of farmhouses whose owners had gone to bed believing this night was like any other. Some reports called it a raid, others called it a diversion, a trick meant to pull German reserves away from wherever the real blow would land. In the confusion of scattered radio traffic and half-formed sightings, no one in the high command yet dared to say the word invasion. Speidel's office that night was thick with cigarette smoke, and the particular exhaustion of men who had been startled awake and had not yet decided how frightened to be. Aides moved between rooms carrying scraps of paper, each one contradicting the last. A farmer near Sainte-Mère-Église reported paratroopers landing in his field. A coastal listening post reported engine noise offshore that faded before it could be confirmed. Speidel read each report twice, searching for the pattern that would tell him whether to wake a field marshal who was, at that very hour, 400 miles away, and utterly certain he had chosen correctly to leave. 50 miles inland, at his headquarters in the town of Saint-Lô, General der Artillerie Erich Marx read the same fragments of news and felt something colder settle into his chest. Marx commanded the 84th Corps, the formation responsible for the very stretch of coastline where Walter Ohmsen's guns now sat silent in the dark. He was a soldier's soldier, a veteran who had lost a leg in Ukraine in the summer of 1941, wounded so badly that most men would have gone home to a desk job and never returned to a frontline command. Marx had refused the desk job. He walked with a prosthetic limb and a cane, and neither had ever slowed him down enough to satisfy his own sense of urgency. This night, of all nights, was his 53rd birthday. His staff had quietly set aside a bottle of wine for the occasion, an old habit of respect for a commander they had come to admire, and it sat unopened on a side table as the reports began arriving. Marx had told his staff there would be no celebration until the enemy showed his hand, and now, staring at reports of parachutes blooming across the Cotentin countryside, he understood with a soldier's instinct that the hand was being shown. He limped to the wall map on his cane, the prosthetic leg dragging slightly against the floorboards, and began marking positions with a stub of pencil, his face unreadable to the young officers watching him. Of all the senior commanders in Normandy, Marx had long been one of the few who believed an Allied landing here, rather than at the narrower crossing near Calais, was not just possible but likely. Belief, though, was not preparation, and no amount of instinct could conjure divisions that did not exist, or ammunition that had never been shipped. Along the coast itself, Vice Admiral Friedrich Ruge had spent the better part of 6 months trying to close the gap between what Germany needed and what Germany had. Ruge had been born in 1894 into a family of sailors, and he understood the sea in a way few army officers ever would. Appointed naval advisor to Rommel the previous November, he had walked every beach from the mouth of the Seine to the tip of the Cotentin Peninsula, pressing for more mines, more steel obstacles, more concrete, more guns. He had gotten some of what he asked for and never enough. In the years after the war, he would write a memoir describing this exact stretch of hours with a bitterness that had not faded even a decade later. "We were preparing to fight the last war," he wrote. They were bringing the next one. He had said something close to those words aloud to Rommel himself weeks earlier, standing on a different stretch of beach, gesturing at a line of obstacles that looked formidable on paper and pitiful against the scale of what any modern navy could bring to bear. Rommel had listened, nodded, and pressed Berlin for more concrete anyway, because there was nothing else to press for. Every request that traveled up the chain of command returned diminished, a fraction of the guns, a fraction of the mines, a fraction of the men who were needed and had long ago been spent on the endless furnace of the Eastern Front. The German High Command's confidence rested on numbers they had built from their own diminished capacity, not from any honest accounting of what an enemy with unbroken factories and unbroken shipyards might actually assemble. Staff officers in Paris and Berlin had gamed out invasion scenarios built around perhaps 20 Allied divisions, supported by something on the order of 3,000 vessels. These were not unreasonable numbers for a nation exhausted by 5 years of total war, rationing steel and oil and manpower down to the last leader and the last conscript. They were simply numbers drawn from the wrong side of the ocean. Walter Ohmsen knew none of this as he climbed the narrow steps to his observation post in the last hour before dawn. He knew only that reports of parachute activity had reached the battery second-hand, garbled and uncertain, the kind of rumor that swept through every coastal position on quiet nights, and usually amounted to nothing. He had ordered his men to their stations anyway, more out of habit than alarm, and had gone up to the concrete platform himself to watch the water the way he watched it most mornings, out of duty rather than expectation. The sky to the east was beginning to lighten, a thin gray seam along the horizon that would, within the hour, become the palest gold of a Normandy sunrise. Somewhere below the platform, a gull cried out over the marsh, and the tide was still going out, leaving long ribbons of wet sand exposed between the rows of steel obstacles the engineers had planted like a forest of iron. Ohmsen lifted his binoculars out of routine, sweeping them slowly across a channel he expected to find as empty as it had been every morning for 2 years. It was not empty. At first his mind refused the image, the way a man's mind will refuse a wound before the pain arrives. He blinked, adjusted the focus, and looked again, and the horizon was still wrong, still thickened with shapes that had no business existing in such numbers. Not 2 ships, not 20. The dark shapes ran unbroken from one edge of his field of view to the other, hull after hull after hull, a mass so dense it no longer read as individual vessels, but as a single continuous wall advancing out of the retreating night. Every assurance Walter Ohmsen had carried in his chest for 2 years, every poster, every briefing, every confident word from officers he had trusted, collapsed in the space of a single breath. He lowered the binoculars, raised them again, and understood that the war he thought he understood had just ended, replaced by something for which no one on this coast, least of all the 32-year-old lieutenant standing alone on a concrete platform above St. Marcouf, had ever truly prepared. At 5:52, the order Ohmsen had waited 2 years to receive finally reached him over the field telephone, a single clipped sentence that turned every drill his crews had ever run into, something real: open fire. 3 minutes later, at 5:55, the first of his 210mm shells left the Skoda barrels and arced out over the water toward the mass of ships filling the channel. Ohmsen watched the shell fall, watched the small white geyser rise and collapse somewhere among vessels too numerous to count, and understood immediately what his own eyes had already told him on the observation platform. It was a drop of water thrown against an incoming tide. His battery fought anyway, because fighting was the only order anyone had given him and the only shape his training could take. Through the morning, Crisbecq's guns engaged the American cruisers Tuscaloosa and Quincy, and later the battleship Nevada, 3 of the most heavily armored warships afloat, hurling shells that could not be aimed so much as hoped for, amid the chaos of counter-battery fire raining down in return. At 6:30, Ohmsen's gun crews tracked a fast-moving destroyer maneuvering close to the invasion beaches and put a salvo into her hull. The ship broke apart and went down, and German reports that morning credited Crisbecq with sinking her, though in the confusion of the day the destroyer had also passed through a minefield laid weeks earlier, and even now historians studying the surviving accounts from her own crew cannot say with certainty which wound proved fatal. What both sides agreed on, then and later, was her name, the destroyer Corrie, the only American destroyer lost in the invasion, and for one battery on one morning, a single, bitter proof that German guns could still draw blood from the ocean of steel bearing down on them. 6 miles to the west, at a strong point the Americans would soon learn to call Widerstands Nest 62. A 20-year-old farm boy named Heinrich Severloh crouched behind a machine gun and watched the same horizon Ohmsen had seen an hour earlier. Severloh had grown up inland, in the small town of Metzingen, and had never laid eyes on the ocean before the army sent him to guard it. Now there was no ocean left to see, only ships, and beneath the ships, sand that would soon be crossed by men his own age carrying rifles toward his gun. He would write decades later that he tried counting the vessels and gave up somewhere past 100, because the horizon itself had stopped being a line and become instead a solid wall of gray steel. Big ships, he remembered, small ships, flat-bottomed ships he had no name for, destroyers cutting back and forth between the larger vessels the way sheepdogs worked a flock, herding the whole armada toward the sand beneath his boots. The sound reached him before the shapes fully resolved in the gray light, a low, continuous rumble that did not rise and fall like thunder but simply persisted, filling the air the way a held breath fills a chest until something has to give. Up and down the 50-mile invasion front, in bunkers and observation towers from the base of the Cotentin Peninsula to the mouth of the Orne River, other young men who had never seen the ocean before, their posting to this coast, were having the same conversation with their own disbelief. Reports crackled over field telephones in tones officers would later describe as almost apologetic, as though the men making them expected to be accused of exaggeration or panic. Not a raid, one voice insisted. Not a feint. Ships beyond counting, stretching in both directions until the eye simply gave up trying to find an edge. The naval bombardment that had begun at 5:30 was, by any measure available to a German officer that morning, a demonstration of a kind of arithmetic no one on this coast had trained to survive. 5 battleships, 20 cruisers, 65 destroyers, and 2 specialized monitor vessels stood offshore and methodically worked through their target lists. The battleship Texas alone fired 255 rounds from her 14-inch guns within the first hour, each shell weighing roughly 1,400 pounds, delivering something on the order of 178 tons of high explosive in 60 minutes, more ordnance than many entire German artillery regiments held in reserve for a full campaign. Before a single Allied soldier's boot touched the sand, naval gunners had already thrown something close to 50,000 shells from destroyers, 23,000 from cruisers, and 3,500 from battleships out across the invasion front, a combined weight of roughly 130,000 tons of explosive steel. General Gunther Blumentritt, chief of staff to the German commander in the West, would later put the lesson into words that every survivor of that morning understood in his bones before he ever heard them spoken aloud. "We had prepared to fight soldiers," he said. "We found ourselves fighting factories." It was not a figure of speech. It was closer to a literal description of what German gun crews were experiencing. An enemy whose shells kept arriving in quantities that made no sense against any peacetime calculation of what a navy could carry, reload, and fire in a single morning, as though the assembly lines of an entire continent had been rerouted directly onto the decks of the ships now anchored a few miles offshore. The sky brought a second lesson before the sun had fully cleared the horizon. Where German officers expected to see their own fighters contesting the air over the beaches, they saw instead a ceiling filled with aircraft in numbers that made counting meaningless. Wave after wave of bombers and fighters, moving with the confidence of men who no longer feared what might rise to meet them. Allied air forces flew more than 14,000 sorties in support of the landings that day. The Luftwaffe in the whole of France could muster perhaps 300 operational aircraft, and on the 6th of June it managed only 319 sorties in total. For every German aircraft that took to the sky that morning, something like 46 Allied planes were already there waiting. Major Josef Priller, commanding a fighter wing from an airfield further inland, made what would become the only Luftwaffe strafing run over the invasion beaches, roaring in low over Sword Beach with a single wingman beside him, guns hammering for a few defiant seconds before both pilots banked away and fled from dozens of Allied fighters converging to hunt them down. It was courage without consequence, a gesture the size of a single match struck against a burning building. What made the imbalance harder for German officers to accept was not simply the count of aircraft or the tonnage of shells, but the technology riding alongside the numbers, machinery that revealed how far the gap between the two armies had widened, while Germany's factories burned under nightly bombing. Anti-aircraft shells fitted with proximity fuses no longer needed a direct hit to bring down a plane, exploding automatically the instant they passed close enough to their target, turning flak batteries into something closer to precision instruments than blind barrages. Naval gunfire, directed by radio from forward observers on the ground and refined by radar, could strike a target miles inland with an accuracy that made German counter-battery fire feel like a previous, cruder century of warfare by comparison. Amphibious trucks solved supply problems German quartermasters had never even managed to properly define, let alone solve. Specialized tanks fitted with flails to detonate mines or bridging equipment to span anti-tank ditches allowed the Allies to breach obstacles through engineering rather than through the bodies of infantrymen sent forward to clear them by hand. Every one of these details, encountered piecemeal across a single day of fighting, added up to a portrait of an enemy that had not simply outproduced Germany, but had out-imagined it. The naval gunfire in particular became an object of a very specific dread among German gun crews in the days that followed. Ships standing far out at sea, invisible from the shore, could put a shell precisely where a forward observer asked for one, and there was no answering that kind of fire with the guns available on the coast. German batteries that attempted counter-battery duels against the warships anchored offshore learned quickly how one-sided the exchange truly was. The ships moved, adjusting position after every salvo. The ships shot back with a volume and accuracy no static coastal position could match. And unlike the men crewing Ohmsen's guns at Crisbecq, the sailors aboard those distant battleships and cruisers were never within reach of a single German rifle. Not every German position broke immediately. At Omaha Beach, well-inland positions and the natural bluffs above the sand gave the defending infantry division genuine advantages, interlocking fields of machine gun fire that turned the first waves of American soldiers into a slaughter the moment their landing craft ramps dropped. Heinrich Severloh, still behind his gun at Widerstands Nest 62, fired more than 12,000 rounds that morning, by his own later account, watching men fall in the surf by the dozen and then by the hundred until the water itself seemed to run red in the shallows. For a brief, terrible window of time, it seemed almost possible that the wall would hold here, that this one stretch of sand might become the place where German resistance finally matched the scale of what was being thrown against it. Then, a little after 8 o'clock, with the American commander ashore weighing whether the entire landing at Omaha might need to be abandoned, something happened that no German officer had trained to expect. American destroyers, taking on the very real risk of running aground or striking a mine in water most captains would never have dared approach, closed to within 1,000 yards of the beach, close enough that their 5-inch guns could no longer miss the individual concrete positions they targeted. Ships with names like McCook and Carmack and Doyle and Frankfurt turned their batteries directly onto the strong points holding the beach, firing at point-blank range until one position after another went silent. It was the moment, more than any other that day, when German officers up and down the coast began to grasp the deeper truth beneath the arithmetic. This was not simply a matter of more ships. It was a willingness to spend them. A German captain treated his vessel as an irreplaceable asset, husbanded and protected, because the shipyards behind him could not easily build another. An American captain could risk his ship, because there would always be another ship behind it, and another behind that. Ashore, the American commander who had spent the worst hour of that morning weighing whether to pull his surviving troops off the sand entirely, watched the destroyer's intervention transform the battle almost in real time. Wireless traffic between the beach and the ships offshore carried increasingly desperate requests for fire on positions that infantry alone could not dislodge, coordinates read off by radio men crouched behind whatever cover the sand offered, corrections shouted back and forth until a shell finally silenced a machine gun that had been killing men for 2 straight hours. It was improvised, dangerous, and it worked, and every German soldier who watched a concrete position that had held through the entire morning finally go silent under naval fire understood, in that instant, that the initiative had changed hands for good. Through the rest of the morning and into the afternoon, the ocean itself seemed to become a machine built for a single purpose, delivering men and steel onto French sand without pause. Landing craft came in waves, disgorged their cargo, and turned back for more. Specialized tank landing craft opened their bows to release 30-ton Sherman tanks directly onto the beach. Massive landing ships, some more than 300 feet long, drove themselves deliberately aground and swung open their doors to release entire companies of armor at once. Amphibious trucks the Americans called ducks swam ashore under their own power, climbed out of the surf, and drove straight up the beach to deliver ammunition and rations to men who had been fighting since before dawn. By the time night fell on the 6th of June, something close to 156,000 Allied soldiers had come ashore by sea and by air, a number larger than the entire German 7th Army, charged with defending the whole of Normandy. In that first day alone, the invaders landed roughly 20,000 vehicles, 1,700 tanks, and 15,000 tons of supplies. The German 7th Army, spread thin across the entire region, could not muster 500 operational tanks between all its units combined. The Allies had put more than 3 times that number ashore before the sun set on a single day. The armored counterattack that might once have thrown such a landing back into the sea never gathered the strength anyone had hoped for. The 21st Panzer Division, the only armored formation close enough to strike on the day itself, did not begin moving until 4 in the afternoon, and even then it took the division most of 3 hours to cover barely 10 miles of road, harried the entire way by aircraft that appeared the instant a column of vehicles showed itself in daylight. When the surviving tanks finally reached the fighting near Sword Beach, they ran into naval gunfire directed by observers on the ground. Shells fired from a battleship sitting more than 15 miles offshore. Rounds capable of punching through armor no tank built by any nation on Earth could have survived. SS Standartenführer Kurt Meyer, commanding a Panzer Grenadier regiment thrown into the fighting nearby, would later describe the sensation in terms that stripped away every illusion of a fair contest. The enemy's material superiority was so great, he wrote, that our own strength was swept away like a wave breaking on a rock. Tank commanders who had crossed France in 6 triumphant weeks in 1940 found themselves reduced to watching their own columns burn from a ditch beside the road, unable to move a single vehicle in daylight without drawing fire from the sky within minutes. The Panzer Arm that had once defined German military prestige to the entire world was being ground down not in a single decisive battle, but in 1,000 small, grinding ambushes from an enemy who rarely needed to fight fair to win. What made the failure of that counterattack even more bitter for the officers who planned it was a deception few of them yet understood they had fallen for. For weeks leading up to the invasion, German intelligence had convinced itself, through a combination of fabricated radio traffic, inflatable tanks arranged in fields to be photographed from the air, and a fictitious army group supposedly commanded by an American general the Germans respected above nearly any other, that the Normandy landings were themselves the diversion. The genuine invasion, German planners believed, would fall weeks later against the narrower crossing near Calais, and armored reserves that might have overwhelmed the beachhead in its first fragile days were instead held back, waiting for a second invasion that had never existed anywhere outside a deception planner's careful fiction. It would be General Leo Freiherr Geyer von Schweppenberg, commanding the panzer forces held in that useless reserve, who finally uncovered the truth, and only then because documents captured from a downed vehicle revealed the American general in question was not sitting idle across the channel at all, but already commanding a very real army fighting its way across Normandy under everyone's nose. By the time the deception unraveled completely, the reserves that might have changed the battle's outcome in its opening week had been frozen in place for exactly as long as the Allies needed them to be. 50 miles away in St. Lo, General Erich Marx had spent the 6th of June exactly as he told his staff he would, marking positions on his map with the stub of a pencil, refusing the bottle of wine still sitting untouched on the side table. He did not live to see the invasion's second week. On the 12th of June, traveling toward Carentan to oversee a counterattack he still believed might blunt the American advance, his staff car was spotted from the air by a roaming fighter bomber. He was struck by shrapnel and died within hours, one of the very first senior German commanders to fall in a campaign that would eventually claim tens of thousands of his countrymen, killed not by an enemy soldier he could see and fight, but by a machine that found him from a mile in the sky and was gone before anyone on the ground even heard the engine. The bottle of wine his staff had set aside for his 53rd birthday was still unopened when word of his death reached the Corps headquarters at St. Lo, and none of the young officers who had watched him mark the map with his cane still hanging from the desk chair could quite bring themselves to move it. He had commanded with a clarity few of his peers matched, had seen the invasion coming when others dismissed the possibility, and it had made no difference at all against an enemy who no longer needed to be outsmarted, only outproduced. Foresight, it turned out, was not a currency that could be spent against factories a man could not see and had no way of reaching. By the following morning, the 7th of June, German reconnaissance pilots returned with photographs that senior officers in Paris initially refused to believe. The Allies were not fighting to capture an intact port, the one objective every German defensive plan had assumed they needed above all else. They were building their own harbors, whole and complete, out of nothing, in open water off a coast that had no harbor at all. Prefabricated in sections across the English Channel and towed into place, these artificial ports would eventually incorporate more than 600,000 tons of concrete, dozens of floating piers, miles of floating roadway, and nearly 100 obsolete ships deliberately scuttled to form breakwaters. Within 2 weeks they would be moving more cargo daily than many established French ports had ever handled. 4 years of German engineering had gone into fortifying harbors the Allies now revealed they had never actually needed. It was, for the officers who studied those reconnaissance photographs in stunned silence, the clearest single image yet of an enemy who no longer played by any rules the German High Command had spent years preparing to counter. At Crisbecq, Walter Ohmsen and his crews fought on through the 7th of June and into the days that followed, trading shots with warships they could not sink in numbers that could not matter, watching their own ammunition stocks dwindle, with no resupply convoy able to reach them past the aircraft patrolling every road inland. The battery would hold out for 5 more days after the invasion began, longer than almost any other coastal position on this stretch of the front, a fact that would later earn Ohmsen one of Germany's highest decorations for gallantry, even as the battle around him was already unmistakably lost. When the position finally fell on the 11th of June, Ohmsen led 78 of his surviving men in a breakout through the American Encirclement, marching nearly 8 kilometers through hostile territory until they reached German lines again, alive in a battle he had long since stopped expecting to survive. His men had stopped speaking in the confident tones of the briefings that once filled their evenings. They spoke instead in the clipped, exhausted shorthand of soldiers who had run out of illusions to lose, tracking the sun each morning less to mark the hour than to count how many more hours of daylight movement the aircraft overhead would deny them. Word of the Corrie's sinking had spread through the battery within hours of the destroyer going down, passed from gun crew to gun crew like a small, hoarded coal of pride in an otherwise collapsing world. One ship struck for every 100 that steamed past untouched, and even that thin comfort had begun, by the second day, to feel less like a victory than an epitaph, the kind of story a man tells himself in the dark to avoid looking directly at everything arrayed against him. By late June, the desperation climbing through the German chain of command had reached the very top of the Western theater. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commander-in-chief in the West and a soldier who had led armies since before most of his subordinates were born, received a telephone call from Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel at the High Command in Berlin, demanding to know why the invasion had not yet been thrown back into the sea. Keitel, a man Rundstedt privately regarded with something close to contempt, finally asked what should be done. "Make peace, you fools," Rundstedt told him. "What else can you do?" Within days he had been relieved of his command, dismissed not for any failure on the battlefield, but for the crime of saying aloud what every officer on the Normandy front had already concluded in private. He packed his headquarters quietly, without protest, a soldier of the old school who understood that honesty and survival in Hitler's Germany had become, by the summer of 1944, almost entirely incompatible qualities, a lesson every officer still fighting in Normandy was learning in his own way, on his own timetable, whether he wished to or not. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel met with Hitler on the 17th of June at a headquarters near Margaville, carrying with him a set of figures he hoped might finally break through the wall of denial in Berlin. Complete Allied control of the air. German divisions fighting at a fraction of their normal strength. Roads that could not be used in daylight without inviting a fighter-bomber attack within minutes. Hitler listened, and then forbade any retreat, demanding the kind of fanatical resistance that asks soldiers to die in positions that could no longer be defended by any rational measure of the word. Rommel left the meeting already certain, in a way he had not quite allowed himself to be certain before, that Germany's defeat was no longer a possibility to be managed, but an outcome to be endured. Within a month, his name would be linked to the officers who tried and failed to kill Hitler in July, and within a season, faced with the choice between a public trial that would destroy his family and a private vial of poison that would spare them, he chose the poison, dying not as a soldier on a battlefield, but as a man quietly disposed of by the government he had served. The battle for the city of Caen offered the clearest single demonstration of what German resistance now actually meant in practice. On the 7th of July, more than 450 heavy bombers dropped roughly 2,500 tons of bombs onto the city in barely 40 minutes, more explosive force than the entire Luftwaffe in France could have delivered in a single mission at any point since the invasion began. The 12th SS Panzer Division, one of the most capable formations Germany still fielded, entered the Normandy campaign with more than 20,000 men and 150 tanks. 6 weeks later, it counted perhaps 300 men still standing and not a single operational tank remaining, 8,000 of its soldiers lost in a single pocket of fighting near Falaise alone. That pocket, sealed between the 12th and the 21st of August, became the graveyard for what remained of organized German resistance in Normandy. Somewhere between 10 and 15,000 German soldiers died inside it. Between 40 and 50,000 more were taken prisoner. More than 300 tanks and self-propelled guns were destroyed in the northern half of the pocket alone, alongside thousands of abandoned trucks and hundreds of lost artillery pieces. A portion of the trapped forces, somewhere between 20 and 50,000 men, did manage to escape the closing ring, but they escaped as scattered survivors rather than as anything resembling a fighting army, stripped of their vehicles, their heavy weapons, and in many cases, their will to keep fighting at all. What the surviving German General Staff came to understand, slowly and with a bitterness that never fully faded, was that they had not lost a military campaign so much as they had lost an equation neither side had ever fought on equal terms. German aircraft production for the year reached something close to 40,000 planes. Tank production peaked at under 2,000 vehicles in a single month. American aircraft production alone that year topped 96,000 planes, alongside nearly 30,000 tanks and 650,000 military trucks, figures that did not even include the parallel output pouring from British, Canadian, and Soviet factories running at the same time. General Franz Halder, the former chief of the German General Staff, calculated after the war that by 1944, the Allied advantage in overall war production had reached something close to 5-1, and in certain categories, trucks especially, closer to 10-1. "We were not defeated," he wrote. "We were mathematically eliminated." The toll this realization took on the men who lived through it went beyond the battlefield casualty lists. Officers who had grown up entirely inside the worldview of the Nazi state, taught from childhood that Americans were soft, undisciplined, incapable of real soldiering, found that worldview collapsing alongside their armies. What they discovered instead was an enemy who let machines perform the hardest and most dangerous labor of war, who coordinated by radio with an ease German units could rarely match, who trained with more ammunition in a single week than some German batteries fired in a month, and who fought with a confidence built on the simple, unshakable knowledge that resupply would always come. Defeat alone might have been survivable. The complete inversion of everything they had been told about their enemy and about themselves proved, for a great many of them, considerably harder to carry, and the rate of suicide among German officers in the campaign's final weeks climbed to levels that unsettled even hardened veterans of the Eastern Front. 10 years after the invasion, in 1954, a gathering of surviving German officers convened privately in the West German city of Bonn to examine what had actually happened to them in Normandy. General Gunther Blumentritt, who had served as chief of staff to both Rundstedt and Kluge during the campaign, delivered the keynote address, and his words carried the particular clarity of a man who had spent a decade turning the question over in his mind without ever quite setting it down. "We learned in Normandy that war had changed fundamentally," he told the room. "It was no longer a contest of armies, but of economic systems. We counted divisions while they counted factories. We measured courage while they measured production." The image that haunts me still is the sight of American bulldozers pushing aside our destroyed tanks to clear roads for their supply trucks. Many of the officers who survived that campaign carried its lesson forward into the rest of their lives in ways that quietly reshaped post-war Europe. Hans Speidel, who had spent the night before the invasion reading garbled reports at Rommel's headquarters, went on to become a general in the very alliance built to contain the next threat from the east, helping integrate a new West German army into a structure no single European nation would ever again have to face alone. A number of his fellow Normandy veterans became early and persistent advocates for the economic integration of Europe, having concluded, in the wreckage of their own defeat, that only nations pooling their industrial strength together could ever hope to approach the kind of productive power that had buried them on a single stretch of French coastline. On the 6th of June 1984, the 40th anniversary of the invasion, Walter Ohmsen returned to the Crisbecq Battery as an honored guest at a small gathering of veterans from both sides of the old fighting line. He was 73 years old, walking now with the careful, deliberate steps of a man who had outlived a war he once assumed would kill him, and he climbed once more to the same concrete platform where he had first lifted his binoculars 4 decades earlier. Speaking to the assembled group, old enemies and old comrades sitting together in a peace neither side had truly expected to survive to see, he offered the only conclusion 4 decades of reflection had left him with. 40 years ago, he said, I stood here and saw the impossible, a sea covered with ships from horizon to horizon. I knew in that moment that everything I had been told was wrong. Weak nations do not build 7,000 ships. Divided nations do not coordinate an invasion of that size. I fired my guns at that armada, and I might as well have been throwing stones at the tide. We sank one destroyer, damaged a few others. For every ship we hit, 100 passed unharmed. Young officers today study tactics from Normandy, he told them. But the real lesson is simpler than any tactic. In modern war, the side that can produce the most wins. We learned that industrial capacity is military capacity. The sea of ships I saw that morning was not just an invasion fleet. It was American industrial might made visible, sailing directly toward a young lieutenant who had believed, until the exact moment he lifted his binoculars, that such a thing could not possibly exist. What Walter Ohmsen and the men beside him witnessed on that gray June morning was never really a battle they could have won or lost through skill or courage or the accident of a lucky shell finding its mark. It was the arrival, made suddenly and irreversibly visible, of a kind of power that had been building for years in factories none of them had ever seen, on a continent most of them had never visited, among a people their own government had spent a decade teaching them to underestimate. They had prepared, with genuine skill and genuine sacrifice, to fight another army. What came ashore that morning was something closer to an entire nation's industrial output, given a uniform and a rifle, and against that, no wall of concrete, however carefully built, was ever going to be enough.